Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. About 10 years ago, when I was living in China, I had a very good friend, and we spent some good times riding motorcycles and playing computer games. Time has passed and we moved to different countries, but the sweet memories are still here. During these years, I have also learned that a friend is much more valuable and much more important than a piece of a hardware or a computer. You can have the best ever computer, you can buy all possible games, but if you don't have someone to play with, it's all pointless. Unfortunately for me, my friend is a Macintosh guy and he rather prefers to do his work using a Mac computer, and he can't install two computers in his apartment due to size restrictions. During the last few years, I was nagging at him and trying to convince him to get himself a gaming setup so we can play every now and then together. Instead, this year he has bought himself an Apple M1 computer or a laptop. I have nothing against the Apple M1 and I actually think it's a really cool piece of tech. This laptop can be used to do lots of different work, but for gaming it's rather a bad option. Yes, you can play some Mac-compatible games, but for Battlefield 4, Battlefield 5, Far Cry and similar games, this Mac laptop is simply not enough. That's why I have decided to make him a sudden and little gift and assemble him a gaming computer. The computer is going to travel to another country, that is why I have quite some restrictions and limitations of what I can use inside the computer. So due to the shipping cost, I need to keep my computer as small as possible and as light as possible. I also do not know if he has ability to connect network cord and I don't want to ask him, so he starts to suspect something. That is why I need to make sure that there is a Wi-Fi capability inside the computer. And naturally, since it's a gift, I need to keep the cost as low as possible, but still keep the computer as capable as possible, because I can't afford making expensive gifts. So let's start with the part selection, what I have decided to go with for this gift gaming computer. First, we need to decide on the CPU. For this tiny build, I have decided to go with QTJ2. This is an LJ1151 mutant, which means we need a B365 or Z170 or similar motherboard in mini-ITX form factor. QTJ2 has 6 cores, 12 threads, and it is locked, means you cannot and shall not overclock it. Obviously, if you have such a tiny chassis, it is not advisable to do overclocking. Overclocking increases power consumption and heat dissipation, which might be a problem in this chassis. The best option would be QNCT, because that CPU is even cooler and costs cheaper, but I did not have it on my hands, while QTJ2 was available straight away. For the motherboard, I have picked AsRock B365 mini-ITX motherboard. There is nothing particularly great about the motherboard, but I was able to buy it from the stores absolutely new for about 100 euros. The motherboard has everything you would need to. Obviously it has CPU socket, memory slots, M.2 slot for PCI Express SSD drives, as well as USB ports and SATA expansion slots if you would need to. Now, this combo of motherboard plus CPU in total costed me 185 euros, which is a very good combo if you keep in mind that a new Core i5-10400F would cost you about 150 euros alone. For the motherboard and CPU, you also need memory. In this case, I had to cut costs as much as possible, thus I have decided to go with the two cheapest Kingston DDR4-2400 memory modules. On this motherboard with this CPU, I was not able to overclock it any faster than DDR4-2400, but I was able to tighten the memory timing slightly. These memories costed me just 30 euros, which I consider to be a very good deal. 16 gigs will be enough for gaming for the next 2-3 years, and DDR4-2400 is not such a big problem if you have limited graphics card capabilities. Then I also need an SSD. It happened that I didn't have any more M.2 SSD drives and I had to pick my last one, which happened to be Transcend 110S for 1 TB. Yes, I could have saved some money by going for 512GB SSD, but these SSDs cost about 60-65 euros, and for this 1 TB SSD I have paid only 85 euros. That's why I have decided not to cheap out and just go 1 TB SSD for 85 euros. For the power supply, I originally planned to pick 80 plus gold Kolink Enclave for 500 watt, but unfortunately, even though the power supply is modular and I am able to detach all of the cables, the power supply itself is a bit too big and it doesn't fit into this tiny chassis together with the graphics card. That is why I had to improvise and look around what I have at home, which power supply would fit into this tiny chassis. It happened to be EVGA W1 600 watt. This power supply is only 80 plus watt certified, but it is more than enough for this build, which will be sipping power. The power supply is not modularized and all the cords are attached to the power supply, but I was still able to find a nice place to locate all of those cords, and you can see it here. The excessive cords are just located on top of the power supply and they don't really bother the build, and they are not going into any of the available fans. EVGA W1 600 watt costed me about 45-50 euros. And for the chassis, I have decided to go with Kolink Satellite mini-ITX. This chassis costed me just 45 euros, and for this money, I think it's a very good purchase. It looks nice, it has plenty of space, but not enough to install graphics card, as you will figure out a bit later on. And I'm in general satisfied with the chassis. It is also lightweight and small in size, so it shall not be too expensive to ship it into another country. For the CPU cooler, I have picked Intel stock or Intel box cooler, which I have received from Core i5-10400F. Some of my previous customers decided to upgrade their CPU cooler and just left me the Intel stock cooler. That's why I have got it basically for free. Of course, I could have installed a low profile, Be Quiet or Noctua CPU coolers, which would be much better in this build, but because I had to cut costs with basically everything, I have decided to use this Intel box cooler and it will be just fine. Of course, cooling capabilities of this Intel box junk is not enough to cool down unleashed QTJ2, that is why I had to power restrict QTJ2 to 65 watt of continuous power consumption. As you will shortly figure out, it doesn't really hurt performance, but in the ideal scenario it would be better to install a more capable cooler and unleash full potential of QTJ2, especially if you plan to play some heavy games or do some heavy productivity workloads. The last and probably the most important part of a gaming computer, the graphics card. Originally, I planned to use AMD R9 Fury X with a liquid cooler. Unfortunately, even though I can mount the graphics card and even though the radiator is kind of fitting into this case, there are no mounting possibilities for the radiators. The radiator is too big to be mounted at the rear instead of the 120mm fan, and there are no mounting holes onto the top panel to be able to attach it to the top of the chassis instead of the SSD or HDD drives. My second option was Gigabyte GTX 1060 for 6GB. Unfortunately, this graphics card didn't fit either, it was a bit too long to fit into this tiny chassis. So my last option was Asus Gigabyte GTX 1060 for 3GB. This was the only graphics card I had on hand which was able to fit into this tiny chassis, and that is what I have used into the build. Hopefully it is gonna be enough, and I think it will be more than enough to play the games that I want to be played on this computer. For the graphics card, I have paid around 120 euros, and please do not ask me where I have got them for this money. I know it is almost next to impossible to find graphics card these days, it is also impossible for me. This card is coming from an ex-miner who decided to sell off his GTX graphics cards, and I bought a bunch of them. All in all, this computer costed me about 510 euros, and I believe that for this money we are getting really capable mini-ITX gaming machine, which is also looking pretty okay. Yes, there are no RGBs, but I'm not a fan of RGBs. Another thing I'm not very happy about this computer is the cable management. I'm always trying to make my builds very nice and tidy, but in this case, using this tiny chassis and a non-modular power supply, it's just impossible. The cables are everywhere and I just had to tie them everywhere to make sure that they are not going into the fans. Still, even with this tiny chassis, there are some upgrade options. First one is of course to replace the CPU cooler with something more capable. Then it's also possible to replace memory with something faster and maybe with 32 gigs. For example, installing two sticks 16GB each DDR4-2400 might be a good upgrade if there will be need to do some streaming or video editing. It is also possible to replace the CPU with, for example, QQLS, which is 8-core 16-thread CPU, or it is also possible to install a desktop Core i9-9900. And of course, you can still replace the graphics card, even though there is no much space for the graphics card. Something like NVIDIA RTX 3060 or even RTX 3060 Ti or AMD RX 6700 XT in small form factor will fit in here, and 600-watt power supply will be able to cope with that. Now let's take a look how this tiny gaming computer is actually performing in games. What are the thermals, what are the FPS values, what kind of CPU and GPU load we have. Battlefield 4. This is probably one of my favorite games, but it's not very new. The game was released many years ago and I used to play it with NVIDIA GTX 460 and Intel Xeon E3-1230V3. With QTJ2 and GTX 1060 I was able to rise up the graphical settings too high, and we are still getting 140 to 200 FPS in most of the cases. GTX 1060 is not powerful enough to load QTJ2 to its maximum. The CPU stays at 45 to 55 watt electricity consumption, which is below 65 watt power limit I have enforced in the BIOS. Thus we can see that 65 watt power limit is not hurting performance in this game. The biggest struggle for me was the extra latency added with my video capture card. When I connect the monitor through the video capture card, I'm getting some extra latency between the picture on the monitor and the real events in the game. This makes the gameplay to be much harder than I was expecting it to be.
I've taken control of objective Alpha.
Battlefield 5 is a much newer game, and this one is much more demanding. It demands GPU and CPU resources. Still, with medium graphical settings, GTX 1060 and QTJ2 are able to produce around 100 FPS at all times. GTX 1060 is working at about 99 to 100%, while QTJ2 gets loaded up to 65 watt. Still, the limit is not reached, and the performance is not hurted by the 65 watt power limit enforced in the BIOS. Overall, the gameplay was very smooth and I was really satisfied. Still, the biggest problem for me was the extra latency added with my video capture card. If I connect the monitor straight to the graphics card, the gameplay is much faster and much sharper and much more enjoyable, but in this configuration I cannot record the video.
I've got you, soldier.
Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War is one more recent title which is also really demanding. This game demands more than 3GB video memory, and in order to be able to fit in the 3GB video buffer limit, I have to use low to medium graphical settings. For this test I'm playing campaign and FPS stays between 60 and 80, so very much playable and not a bad result at all. Still, GTX 1060 is already starting to show its age, and 3GB video memory buffer is simply not enough to rise up the graphical settings in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. QTJ2 does a really good job here. Power package stays at about 40-45 watt, which means that the 65 watt power limit enforced in the BIOS doesn't hurt performance in this game either. Ideally, QTJ2 should be paired with something like RTX 2070, RX 5700 XT, or even RTX 3060. Even in this configuration, QTJ2 will not be the bottleneck. Call of Duty Modern Warfare is a slightly older game, but it still wants to have more than 3 gigs of video memory. Again, I was forced to use low to medium graphical settings because 3GB video memory buffer is not enough for something more. Again, playing campaign because I do not want to go to the multiplayer with extra added latency with my video capture card. With this configuration, we are getting more than 100 FPS almost all the time. QTJ2 consumes up to 55 watt of electricity, which is 10 watts less than the 65 watt power limit. And for the finish, I have executed 2 more gaming benchmarks. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a recent and a very demanding game. It wants to have more than 3 gigs VRAM as well. Using the built-in gaming benchmark with a mix of low and medium graphical settings, we are getting about 60 FPS on average, with the dips to 35 FPS. It's not an ideal gameplay, but Assassin's Creed Odyssey is not a fast-paced game, so 30-60 FPS is pretty much playable and you are getting console-like experience or even better. In this game, QTJ2 chills at 35 watt electricity consumption, thus we can install something very powerful, something like RTX 2080 or RTX 3070, and QTJ2 will not be the bottleneck. Far Cry New Dawn is a slightly older game, and here 3 gigs of video memory is enough for high quality settings. Again, using the built-in game benchmark and getting around 70 FPS on average with the dips to 55 FPS. This is a very respectable result and the gameplay is rather smooth. QTJ2 stays at about 40 to 50 watt of electricity consumption, while GTX 1060 is loaded to 9900% all the time. Yet again, we can see that 65 watt power consumption limitation enforced in the BIOS for QTJ2 is not hurting gaming performance in any of the tested games. As you can see, this tiny machine is able to deliver pleasant gaming experience in almost every game. Yes, sometimes here and there you need to tweak the graphical settings, but what would you expect from a years-old GTX 1060 which has just 3 gigs of VRAM? 65 watt TDP limitation on QTJ2 and DDR4-2400 doesn't really matter in this case because NVIDIA GTX 1060 3 gigs is not fast enough to be limited by the memory speed or by the 6-core QTJ2, even if it is 65 watt TDP restricted. So all in all, I'm very happy with this tiny little gaming machine and I hope my friend will be enjoying it as well. This video will be out once my friend receives the computer and tries it out and gives me some feedback about what he feels about it, how does it perform in his games, and what he thinks about heat and noise production. That's why I might be editing this video later on and adding some extra fragments which I will be recording afterwards, but for now that's all I can tell you about this tiny machine. I hope it was interesting, I hope you have enjoyed it, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, goodbye!